All right, so happy birthday to Louisa May Alcott. And I was also remembering that, in fact, Emily Dickinson's birthday is coming up in a week or so. She and I share the same birthday, so I always think of her. But it's interesting with Louisa May Alcott. Here we have a person who lived, I mean, they were born 2 years apart, and they died actually 2 years apart. And Emily lived a life of complete obscurity while she was alive. And Louisa, on the other hand, left volumes and volumes of journals and letters. And, as I'm sure you all know, that Emily was basically discovered later because her sister-in-law refused to burn her poems as she had requested. So it's just amazing to think of the different life that they lived in, not so far apart. Emily being in Amherst and Louisa being in the Boston area for her life. So, but as I said, Louisa left this legacy of letters and journals, and writing was her compulsive trait. It was a habit as much as an outlet, and her conversations with herself and with others in her world just poured out in a steady stream of words, chronicling nearly 50 years of her life. She died at 55. As early as 1850, when she was 17, Louisa valued introspection and wisdom she got from writing in her journals. And she wrote, "Must always try to think of the willful, moody girl I try to manage. In my journal, I write of her to see how she gets on." So it was really her way of learning about herself as much as it was to produce things to put out into the world. So before her death in 1888, Louisa, who had grown up in poverty in the early part of her life, which I'll talk about in a minute, she knew that her book sales had passed the 1 million mark. And she also realized that she had made the considerable sum of $200,000 from her fiction, which in today's dollars is about $5 million. She was the primary breadwinner in the family, and especially in the early, this is a fuzzy screen, but we'll get some better ones. In the early days of her, well, actually she did this all the way through in her journals. She chronicled every penny she made from whatever she was doing. So in this little list here, it's some stories: A Pair of Eyes, Whisper in the Dark, ML, and she notes that she began Moods, which was one of her novels. Here's a easier one. She taught school, she did nursing, that's the second item. Colleen's Punishment was a thriller that she wrote, and so you can see that she kept track. This is from a later time, and I'm not sure what on picket duty was, but she got $50. Hospital Sketches was a book that she was published after her Civil War nursing stint, and Thoreau's Flute was a poem, as I remember. Anyway, so until her success with writing, the family lived largely at the behest of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who greatly admired the philosophy of her father. They had met in 1835, Bronson Alcott, and they had basically, Bronson and Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, Charles Lane, they're all transcendentalists, which was a philosophy that rejected Puritan theology because they felt that it denied humans creative and spiritual vibrance. And they believed that everyone should have access to God. And they felt that God was within the person rather than external to the person. So Emerson explained that the basic truths of the universe were acquired by intuition, and that one never has to reason or prove, but simply perceive God and spirituality. And the beliefs of the transcendentalists translated into a variety of lifestyles, which I think is one of the most interesting things about them. For the first time in history, women were accepted and valued as intellectual equals of men. And transcendentalists were ardent abolitionists. And they also, they welcomed reforms in dress, diet, and society, and experimentation and all kinds of things was encouraged. So Bronson's, Louisa's father's educational theories are really a direct result of his philosophical leanings. So let's look at the parents in this situation here. We have, Louisa was the second daughter of Bronson and Abigail May, who met while Abigail was visiting her brother, Samuel J. May, a minister of the Unitarian Church in Brooklyn, Connecticut. And Bronson was also from Connecticut, and he had grown up in poverty and obscurity, and or at least poor. And he worked as a peddler, and he took something like 5 trips. This is before he met Abigail. 5 trips down to the South where he sold pots and pans, walking from house to house. And he also had educated himself in all the classics and Socrates, and so he would work as a teacher as he was peddling pots and pans. So when he happened to visit Samuel May, Abigail fell for him. He was this tall, handsome, itinerant school teacher at that point with radical ideas, and she was from a family of really progressive thinkers. And one of the other things about the Abigail and Bronson and their families was they also believed in voluntarism, and that is something beyond even the transcendentalists in a way, because it basically is the philosophy that no one should do anything that they have not decided to do for themselves, what they have not volunteered for. So therefore, slavery shouldn't exist because a person has not said they wish to be a slave. And this actually set them apart from other abolitionists in the North, because there were people who didn't believe in slavery, but at the same time, there was this fear that if slaves were freed, that they would be there in society, and there was this fear of intermarriage with Black people. And so that was why, actually, when slaves were freed here, and we had slaves in this part of Connecticut where I live, and they were essentially, when they were freed, the selectmen in the town would decide whether that person could have a business or own land. And in most cases, they decided that they couldn't, and they therefore had to leave because they couldn't support themselves after they were freed, because of this fear of, amalgamation. So anyway, going on with Bronson and Abigail, they were married on May 23rd, 1830 at King's Chapel in Boston, where the May family were members. And in terms of Bronson's job as an itinerant school teacher, at that time in history, there were states where some states were more regulated than others about public education. But basically, kids did not have to, if there was public education, kids did not have to go to school. But if they stayed home, they said the parents had to teach them. And so these itinerant school teachers would come into town and, you know, if the parents didn't agree with what was going on in whatever school there was, an itinerant school teacher like Bronson would live with someone in the town and teach a gathering of kids. So after they were married, Abigail and Bronson moved to Philadelphia because there were wealthy Quakers in Philadelphia at that time, and they had started a school, and somehow they knew about Bronson. So he was invited down to start the school. And that's where their first daughter, Anna, was born in 1831. And then they moved to Germantown because the school was not thriving, not because of Bronson's teaching methods at that time, but because some of the wealthier, older Quakers were dying off and the school wasn't being well supported, and they were basically not making any money. Louisa was born in 1832 in Germantown on her father's birthday. So yesterday was also Bronson's birthday. Here's Louisa. This is one of the first photographs of her. It's 1857. Before Louisa was 2, they returned to Boston because they were really, at this point, impoverished in Philadelphia for the opening of Bronson's unconventional temple school, which was at the Masonic Temple in downtown Boston. And then a third daughter was born, Elizabeth, called Beth. And unfortunately, as Louisa described in her journal, they were not quite as progressive actually in the North as they were in the South. And she said, my father believed that learning was a natural process and invited learning like Socrates. And this is the interior. It's not, this was actually a drawing done by Bronson, but it's very kind of hard to, well, it's not too bad in a large view here, but you can sort of see the layout of the with the kids sitting around. So Bronson's process was to invite learning like Socrates, and he felt that learning lay in the art of asking questions, apt and fit questions, and leading the mind by its own light to the perception of truth. So in a typical lesson, he would say, the best thoughts do not lie at the surface of the mind. We have to dive under to get at them like pearl fishers. I'm going to ask you some questions and prove to you that you're capable of thinking on this subject. You'll be teaching yourselves and you'll be teaching me. And then he might ask, what is your conscience? Have you looked within yourself and found your conscience? Do you think your wishes are bad or good? And homework in Bronson School was usually writing a journal of mind and conscience to develop habits of mental analysis. And in the Alcott family, they all kept journals, and they read each other's journals. Louisa was keeping a journal from the point where she could write, and they would leave notes to each other in their journals. And on the occasion of birthdays, Bronson would write something. He'd write a summary of how he felt their character was developing. Bronson also felt that children should only be in school about 4 hours a day, and the rest of the time should be spent playing and reading. And this was considered a dangerous idea by some parents. But the crowning blow for the Temple School was the admission of a Black student in 1839, as Louisa described, and soon she and her sisters were the only other students in the school. So Bronson was labeled a heretic and the school closed. And a son, another child was born that their only son was born and died in 1839. So at that point, Emerson, who had had some conversations with Bronson, invited the family to Concord and arranged for Bronson to become superintendent of schools. But again, his philosophy of, this is Ralph Waldo Emerson, of stimulation rather than rote learning did not go over well with the parents, and he was not invited back after the first year. And then a fourth daughter was born in Concord in 1840, and the family had to move again. And so during that time, he basically, after that point, he basically couldn't get hired. And Louisa and the family was basically sort of at the mother was doing things. They were taking in boarders, they were wherever they moved. And Bronson occasionally worked at day labor, but often food was scarce for the family, and he was a vegetarian, and there were long stretches of eating only vegetables and apples washed down with cold water, he became increasingly engrossed with his philosopher friends and journals and self-cultivation. So, but going, just one more thing about Bronson, he was so dedicated to understanding how children learned. I mean, he truly loved teaching and loved children, that he conducted research on his own children in infancy and recorded their responses in detail. And those are all in the archives that you can read. And that information from that time, he would do things like withhold food, or not for a prolonged period of time, but just to measure, to see their reaction, take something away. Or I read that he actually pricked them with a pen or something at one point. But that their responses were recorded in such detail that it was used by Jean Piaget to corroborate and build his own theories of child cognitive development. And so in a nutshell, Bronson really introduced the idea that children think differently than adults. And before that, people thought that children were little adults. Basically, Piaget developed that further in his own writings and research, that saying that children's minds are not just smaller versions of adult minds. And Piaget also observed his nephew and his daughter, and went back and forth with Bronson's notes of his observations. So here's the family, and they're eating a lot of vegetables, or as many as they could. And but while they were there in Concord, when they were living in that area, they were also in a really unique universe, because this is Concord Academy, which was organized by Henry David Thoreau and his brother. And so Louisa and her sisters were studying with Thoreau and Emerson, and she describes in her journals what a wonderful environment it was. And Ralph Waldo Emerson was financially taking care of them and providing them a place to live while they were there. So the next episode in their life was actually preceded by Bronson, in pursuit of his philosophy and so forth. He went to England, where his under the being arranged by Emerson. He went because in England they were much more accepting of Bronson's ideas, and so while he was in England, he was really restored to his mission to promulgate this philosophy. And when he came back, it was decided that amongst him and Charles Lane and a couple of other of the transcendentalists, that they would start a community, kind of like a commune, out in Harvard, Mass. This is the view from the place where they were, of the Monadnock region, and they were in this farm, which was not an easy life because they wanted to establish a model community and making use of no animal products or animal labor, except, as Abigail Alcott observed, for that of women. She and her small daughters struggled to keep the household and the farm going while the men went about the countryside philosophizing. And it only lasted about 6 months for a number of reasons. They didn't have any food. And when they had arrived in Fruitlands in something like June, they set about planting all these apple trees, which were going to, supply them. But it takes a while to get an apple off an apple tree. And so 6 months later in the winter, Abigail insisted that she was going to leave with her daughters, with or without Bronson. Louisa wrote an account of the experience several years later entitled Transcendental Wild Oats, in which she said, "We were to live on vegetables and fruit, with no benefit of anything coming from dead or living beast, no wool, no milk, no meat, no fish. Father lived mainly on Play-Doh." So eventually, after 2 more moves, the family moved back to Concord and lived across the street from Emerson in a house they called Hillside. And this was also a relatively happy time, and it's recollected actually in the first few chapters of Little Women. Louisa loved the Emerson family, and her first book, Flower Fables, was written for Emerson's daughter, Ellen Emerson. And she idolized Emerson himself and described him as her inspiration, saying that she admired the simple beauty of his life, the truth and wisdom of his books, and as an example of a great good man. And I think she was just totally in love with him. And in fact, at the end of her life, she was destroying her certain journals and things from her past. And she made note of getting rid of all her love letters to Emerson that she never mailed, but she kept them. Emerson gave her access to his library, and both, he and Thoreau continued to be her teachers. So again, Emerson was almost the sole support for the Alcott family, and he would arrange for Bronson to be paid for engaging in philosophical conversations. And that's why this picture with the 3 apples next to him, he would sit in this place on the road next to the house. And as people walked by, he would say, I have a question for you. And he'd, pull someone in to talk about philosophy. And actually, Nathaniel Hawthorne lived next door to them. And Louisa made note in her journals that she had discovered that Hawthorne was taking like a 5-mile detour so he could avoid walking by Bronson and not getting sucked into one of his philosophical discussions. But during those years in Concord, Louisa, she spent her teenage years there. She discovered her athleticism, and she ran in the woods for long distances. And she also described walking from Concord to downtown Boston for an evening lecture or play, a trip that would take 5 hours one way. And she had decided, again, also by the age of 15, that she was not interested in marriage, and she was going to find a way to support the family, whether it be by sewing, teaching, or some other kind of servitude. Her mother was of the same mind. Abigail is called the first social worker of Boston, because as they were on the move from Hillside, they went into Boston, and it was a very difficult place to live because they had no money. And Louisa noted that it was just torturous to see all these wonderful things that they couldn't possibly buy. But her mother was doing all kinds of things, taking care of people, and also trying to create jobs for young women. At one point, when Louisa was 19, Abigail started an employment agency to match young women with work situations. And a Mr. Richardson of Dedham was looking for a companion for his sister, and Louisa took the job. As she described, "The Honorable Mr. Richardson taught me what servitude was. When I refused his advances in his study under the guise of having oral readings and metaphysical discussions, he relegated me to the outside, where I dug paths in the snow, fetched water, split kindling, and sifted ashes. I was paid $4 at the end of 7 weeks, drudgery. My outraged mother sent the money back, and I went back to teaching and sewing." And this experience and others would become the basis for her book entitled Work, in which she talks about women's, what happens to women at work. But this was published several years later. But as she described, at the same time, every event in her life, she said, was fodder for her imagination. And she was writing stories in her journals, and soon, she said, she was spinning with plots about strong-minded women and poor lost creatures. And at that point, her poems and stories for children were being accepted in magazines. Emerson called her the children's poet and encouraged her to submit her writing to magazines. But at the same time, she also began to submit sensational fiction, pot boilers and bodice rippers, but under an alias, A.M. Barnard. And that was something that wasn't discovered actually until the 1950s, when a couple of very smart women who had a bookstore in New York discovered this connection between A.M. Barnard and these serialized stories that were published in the at that time, and Louisa May Alcott. And her stories were bringing in money. They were bringing in $10 and $20 here and there. And she said, "I could pay the family debts and get father a pair of shoes and pay for May's art classes," her sister. Her publisher colluded with her. And in one letter, she wrote to him, "Dear Alf, I intend to illuminate the ledger with a blood and thunder tale, as they are easy to compose and are better paid than moral and elaborate works like Shakespeare. So don't be shocked if I send you a paper containing a picture of Indians, pirates, wolves, bears, and distressed damsels in a grand tableau." Lost my place here. Over a title like "The Maniac Bride" or "The Bath of Blood, a thrilling tale of passion." Of course, the tale will appear anonymously. It would not do for the author of Flower Fables to emerge as the creator of "The Maniac Bride." Your Louis. So at the same time as this is happening, in terms of her discovering herself as a writer and putting herself out there, there were a lot of other things happening particularly in the women's movement. In 1848, the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Conference, Elizabeth Blackwell receives a medical degree, the first woman to receive a medical degree. Then there's the first National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, and then in 1851, Sojourner Truth gives her "Ain't I a Woman" speech. And in 1852, Uncle Tom's Cabin is published. And in 1855, Lucy Stone keeps her name after marriage, which was also the first time that had been done. And those who followed suit were called Lucy Stoners. And in 1857, Elizabeth Blackwell founds the first hospital staffed by women. So all of this is happening, you know, around, and Louise is aware of it. She's very well read and just steeped in what was going on at the time. And then there was the, they were still in Boston, and Emerson decided that they needed to be back in Concord. So he made it possible for them to purchase the Orchard House. And that's the place that they lived there for 20 years. And that's when you go to Concord and visit Louisa May Alcott's home, that's the place. And Henry David Thoreau, who was also a surveyor, he worked on the plans for the renovation of the house with Bronson and scoped it out. And eventually, Orchard House is also the setting for Little Women, as you probably know. But at the same time, we have the Civil War brewing, and this is actually Bronson's study at Orchard House, where he, you know, continued to be working very closely with Emerson and collaborating with him. This is Orchard House around 1860, and I'll eventually show you what it looks like today, which is very similar, actually. This little grouping of people down here, it didn't indicate who they were, but the person on the right definitely looks like Bronson, so it might be him and his wife and one of the daughters. This is Louisa's study at Orchard House, her bedroom, actually. And this is the little table that Bronson, this is a tiny table. It looks big here, but it's a round table that faces the window. And this is where she did, well, she was writing at Orchard House. This is where she wrote. So in 1860, at the start of the Civil War, Captain John Brown spoke at the Concord Town Hall. And Louisa had been attending anti-slavery meetings for a long time. And a few months later, when the news arrived that John Brown had died at Harper's Ferry, Louisa decided that she had to go to war. She was 30 and beginning to achieve more success with her stories. And as she described at the time, I was churning with stories. My quill flew in my hands, remembering a fugitive from slavery who had hidden in our house, and I wove a tale about a man, half black, half white, whose hand was branded with the initials ML, and who was loved by a white woman. Too sensational, though. It was rejected. So what she did do was to apply to be a nurse. And she was accepted immediately and assigned to the Union Hotel Hospital in Georgetown, Virginia. And within 4 weeks, she contracted typhoid pneumonia, and Bronson went down to Virginia to bring her back to Concord. Her health was permanently damaged by that, by the fever, but mostly by the mercurous chloride, with which was what they treated people with typhoid pneumonia with at the time. And basically it causes kidney damage and all kinds of other ills, which initially she recovered somewhat, but eventually that was, you know, these were long-term disabilities that eventually ended her life. But when she did gradually recover enough to start writing again, which was in about 12 weeks after she came back, she had written many, many letters home during the 6-week period that she was down there, describing in great detail what she saw. And so she took those letters and she wrote a slightly fictionalized account of what she had seen in the hospital and experienced. And it was serialized in the Boston Commonwealth. and she received $40 along with fan letters from across the country. And then it was published in book form in August 1863. And when the Union Army sent a copy of this book to every family of every Union soldier, she became a household name. So that was really what put her on the map, was hospital sketches. And it's a wonderful, it's really a wonderful little book. It's small. I think it's up at the Mystic Noack Library. Her personal reaction was pride that she had vividly described the horrors of war, and that she hoped that she had given some hope that all the slaughter was for an important cause. And then in December 1863, this is Hospital Sketches, she published 2 more books, and she was also doing dramatizations, and she did the dramatization of scenes from Dickens, which opened in Boston as a benefit for the Sanitary Commission. Sanitary Commission was an organization that made bandages and all kinds of relief, I guess today, personal protective equipment for the Army. In 1864, her novel Moods was published under her own name, but she still depended on her thrillers under her pseudonym for a reliable income. And she described herself saying, "I was a writer with 2 heads, one climbing trees in the fairy world of children, and the other dropping a stone on the head of an unscrupulous rival." In 1863, Louisa's first thriller was published under her name, Pauline's Passion and Punishment. And it's considered a simpler work of storytelling than her later works in this genre, basically concentrating on the flames of passion. And when the Civil War ended, she now was very well known, in fact. And she spent a year in Europe as the companion of Anna Weld. And that was her route. And on her return to Boston, again, here's her journal, documenting what she'd earned. That's a page number on the bottom, 154. She accepted a job as editor for a children's magazine called Mary's Museum for $500 per year. She was also the major contributor. And in 1866, her most important thriller, Behind a Mask, was published. And it had a well-constructed plot and good storytelling, but it was considered a melodrama rather than a mystery by those who critique sensation writers. And then in 1867, her publisher, Thomas Niles, who she had a wonderful relationship with, he advised her at other publishing that she had done with other organizations, and basically saved her from losing her copyright on much of her material. But he asked her to write a book for girls. And at first she refused. She said she didn't think she really knew it that much about girls, and she didn't even like them. Then she said, well, I guess I can try to remember, what me and my sisters used to do when we were young. And so finally and she didn't want to write the book, but her father insisted that she had to write it. And finally, she went into her usual writing vortex. And what she would do is she would go off and she would rent a hotel room somewhere, or usually it was a hotel or a boarding house or something, so that she didn't have to interact with anyone. And she basically ate apples pretty much while she was doing this. And she would just write nonstop. And she said, when my right hand gave out, I forced my left hand to write. And she just wrote and wrote. So, and ultimately, she had wanted to call, in 6 weeks, she finished part 1 of Little Women. And she had wanted to call it Young Women, but she conceded, and it was published in both the US and England at the same time, and it was an immediate bestseller. And readers clamored for more, and part 2 was published the following spring in 1872, when she was Little Women. Just a note about this picture. This was an illustration done by her sister, May, who is the artist, but they actually decided to put her illustrations aside because they didn't feel that they were strong enough for the book. So finally, another artist was hired to illustrate the book. And this was Louisa at 40 in 1872. And she wrote in her journal, 20 years ago, I resolved to make the family independent if I could. At 40, that is done. Debts all paid, and we have enough to be comfortable. It has cost me my health, perhaps, but I still live. There is more for me to do, I suppose. And she gave her energy, besides to writing, to every practical reform and abolition and women's rights. And in 1875, she attended the Women's Congress in Syracuse, where she was introduced by Mary Livermore, and she contributed to Lucy Stone's Women's Journal, the famous Lucy Stone, while organizing Concord women to vote in the school election, and she became the first woman to register her name to vote in that election. She continued to produce a stream of children's books and wrote an adult novel that was inspired by Goethe, a modern Mephistopheles, I can never say that word, published in 1877. So Louisa and her widowed sister, Anna Pratt, who had 2 sons, bought, eventually in 1877, they sold the Orchard House because it was not an easy place to live still, and her mother was very frail. And they bought Thoreau's house. Thoreau had died several years before, and they moved their mother and father into it just a few days before her mother died in 1877. And at that point, Bronson started his School of Philosophy in Concord, and his daughters saw to it that the lecturers and their audiences were housed and fed. And Louisa, when asked for her definition of philosophy, she replied, my definition is of a man up in a balloon with his family and friends pulling the ropes which confine him to earth and trying to haul him down. She spent considerable time in Boston, especially in order to write. And sometimes she shared her rooms at the Bellevue Hotel with her sister May, for whom she paid for art lessons. They went abroad together on her second trip to Europe with May, and May was able to establish herself as an artist. This was a ticket to the Concord School of Philosophy. One second, let me check. So this was a ticket to have a class at the Concord School of Philosophy. And in 1878, May, who was then living in Paris and an artist, met Ernest Nieriker, who was a Swiss businessman, and she was 38 and he was 23, and they got married. And she settled in Paris with him, but died a few weeks after the birth of her daughter, who was named for Louisa and was called Lulu. May wanted Louisa to raise Lulu, and her husband agreed. So the next year, in September, when Lulu was almost 11 months old, she arrived in Boston, and Louisa took her on as her own child and delighted in raising Lulu. And she wrote Lulu's library for her. And this is Lulu, a little older. And Lulu actually lived until 1975. She lived mostly in Europe. And for Louisa, her health continued to decline, and she tried various doctors and cures, probably not realizing what was really at the, the crux of her health problems, which was the mercury poisoning. And she tried everything from a diet of only milk to strictly vegetarian, and did complete bed rest and all kinds of painful exercise routines. And when her father suffered a stroke in 1882, the same year that Emerson died, she established a home for him with Anna and Anna's two sons and little Lulu at 10 Louisburg Square in Boston. And she herself didn't live there. She moved from place to place in search of health and peace to write, finally settling in a private hospital in Roxbury. And she was only in her mid-50s at this point, but felt that her death was imminent. So she, these are the two children of her sister, and she adopted John, who was one of those two, illegally, and willed him her copyrights in trust, stipulating that the income be shared by Anna, Lulu, John, and Anna's other son, Fred. And this is the last photo that was taken of, photograph that was taken of Louisa in 1887, and she's with the actor Richard Murdoch. On March 1st, 1888, she visited her father for the last time, and she reported in her journal that father said, "I'm going up, come with me." And she responded, "Oh, I wish I could." Bronson Alcott died on March 4th, 1888, and Louisa died 2 days later on March 6th. And she was buried next to her father and her neighbors, Emerson, Thoreau, Hawthorne, and in the up on Author's Ridge in Sleepy Hollow Cemetery in Concord. I found this, she was actually on a commemorative stamp in 1940, the famous American series. And this, in this March 2020, right before the pandemic, I was doing research for this talk, and I went up to Concord and took a picture of the house, and it's very much the same as it was back in 1870. And Louisa's bedroom at Orchard House, which has been it was sold, when Orchard House was sold, it's interesting, it was sold to a family, and they basically kept it, they kept their things for some reason, the Alcotts, some of the Alcotts things, and it didn't go out of their family. So the organization, Orchard House Association, bought the house back from that family. So it's been kept very much the same. And I went to Sleepy Hollow to see Louisa's grave, and on her stone were little notebooks and pens and pencils, and over there under those two rocks was a $5 bill. So it was amazing to think of how she's touched people and stayed, such a universal image of hard work and writing. I'm not sure what time it is.
We're at 6:53.
Okay, so I'll show you these pictures. Bronson also went on tour in the 1870s, and it was interesting. Louisa hated fame, but basically, she's getting this is a poster for Bronson's talk where they misspelled his name, but her name is bigger than his name. Kind of fascinating. So this was me when I was performing my play. This was back in 2008, and there's the play, and it's up at the library, and I think it's at the bookstore. But anyway, you can always be in touch with me if you want to have a copy of it. So anyway, any questions out there? Stop share.
Thanks,
Okay.
Ruth. I was going to say too, if people want to ask questions directly,
Sure.
you can still write into the chat if you're more comfortable, or if you have a question, you can just kind of unmic and ask.
Everyone is sleeping.
Ruth, I was going to ask, when did you start, did you read Louisa May Alcott as a little girl, or when did your kind of more in-depth research interests begin for you?
Actually, it was back in around 2000 or maybe 1998. I was working on another play. I'd written a play about Emily Dickinson, and I was working on that. And thanks to Jane Percy, who's here, she got me an invitation to work with a wonderful director in London on that play. And while we were working on it, the walking and so forth, he said, "Have you ever thought of performing Louisa May Alcott?" And I never had thought about it. And a couple of years went by, and it just stuck in my mind. And then I started researching and got a hold of her journals, and I realized what an amazing, fascinating person she was. So it was just by serendipity. And thanks to Jane.
Thanks. Someone has also asked, of all the adaptations, which is your favorite and why?
You mean the Little Women?
I would think so, yeah.
I don't know. I haven't seen them all. I haven't seen all of the adaptations, the movie versions. I didn't really like the most recent one that much. I thought it was sort of, I don't know, it seemed out there. But anyway, that's me. I prefer the book, actually.
It's always a safe answer at a library program. And somebody has asked, any thoughts to why Louisa never married? Some point to that she perhaps was lesbian, and even hinted possibly at transgender ism based on things Louisa said, but also I could see she became the quote man of the family and perhaps didn't have time for romance. Any ideas?
I think all those things are possible, but I think at a very young age, she, for a woman to get married, you knew there was no way to avoid having children. And she felt this compulsion to support the family and take care of them, and knowing that she could potentially get married and die in childbirth, or, which happened to many women. I'm sure that went through her mind. I'm sure it went through every woman's mind that was the risk, but I don't know. She resisted marrying the character Joe, when she was working on part 2 of the book that became part of the book. Everyone wanted to marry him off to Laurie, I guess. Yeah. And she was being encouraged by the publisher to marry, and she's, I'm going to marry her off. And finally she gave in by allowing the character marry the professor. That was her compromise. But I don't know the answer to that question, but I think she was so, she was a very strong-willed person. So probably would have been challenging to find a person who was she could deal with. Anyone else?
Ruth, I have a question. Hi, Ruth.
Hey.
Hi. I have a question. It's more of a comment. Last year, I went to the Orchard House and I went to the Living History Christmas exhibit. I just wanted to, have you ever been to that? It's really nice. They have, you go in the house and they have actors, and the woman who is the Orchard House director, she's Louisa, and you go all through the house and the little actors. It's really nice. Have you ever been there?
Yeah, I haven't done the Christmas, but I know Jan Turnquist. I just actually got a letter from Orchard House, and they were talking about how they are closed down.
Yeah, that's what I figured.
They're really suffering financially because they thought that, you know, they didn't get any benefit from the movie because that's in the public domain. And so, but they were geared up for tons of people, and they said they're, you know, they had huge numbers of people coming in January and February to the museum, and the pandemic hit. So they're not going to be reopening for a while, but it's definitely a wonderful, it's a fun, I love going there. I love the Orchard House.
That's nice.
Yeah, that's a good idea. When they, maybe next year.
Maybe next year, maybe next Christmas.
Yeah.
Ruth?
Yeah.
Do you know why Lulu was given, adopted by Louisa, or why she was sent back to her? Was it because Louisa had more money, or why?
Well, you know, her sister, May, I guess she knew she must have known that she made a decision about what should happen to Lulu, and she had asked her husband, said, I would like to have Lulu go back to my sister. And, you know, Lulu was there. She went to the family in Switzerland because that's where he was from, and was with his family for a while. But then somehow the decision was made to fulfill May's request and send her to Boston. So, you know, maybe it was he was a lot, I mean, he was only 24 or something. So, and eventually, when May, I think when May and, I mean, when, let's see, when at some point, they went to visit the family afterwards. They connected with the family in Switzerland, and there were good feelings between them.
So May lived. She didn't die at childbirth, did she?
Her sister?
Yeah.
She did. She died 2 weeks after, or a week or two after giving birth.
Oh, she did. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I was probably flying through this stuff so fast that, yeah, she did. She died of spinal meningitis after, which she contracted at childbirth.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, she probably wouldn't have sent her back if she was.
Well, I wondered. That seems okay. That makes a lot more sense.
Does anyone else have other questions that you wanted to ask?
Well, feel free to email me if you have questions. It's ruthwcrocker@gmail.com. Put the W in there because there's a Ruth Crocker in Australia. So she does forward mail to me, but.
That's very kind of her.
Did you say that the copy of your play can be found at the library?
Yeah, I think there are some copies. I don't know if they're still there, but I can put a copy up there, certainly.
That would be wonderful. I'd love to read it.
Okay.
I'll follow up with an email too. I can link it. I'll make sure. I think it's in our catalog, but I'll just double check and I'll link to it in the email.
Okay.
Oh, Ruth.
Yeah.
Just wondering, do you have a video of the play when you did it, or do you still do it at all? I love the Emily Dickinson. I remember you doing that one.
You know, actually, I have a really, it was a really bad video. There was a lot of noise in the background or something. So I don't really have a video, as far as I remember, of the Louisa performance. So it's
Yeah. And you don't do it anymore.
I haven't done it in quite a while. I kind of doubt if I will do it again. I'm not sure. I'm not sure I fit into the dress, you know?
That was the problem. The last time with Emily Dickinson, you actually fit into it. I said, never again.
Once I don't fit into the dress, I can't do it anymore.
We do have, we have one last question in the chat, and that's, what are you working on now?
Oh, actually, I'm working on a historical fiction book that's set in this a little later. It's a little later than Louisa's period, but there's a lot of echoes from that time. So it's a lot of fun. I have never written fiction before, and I'm really enjoying it. It's just a magical process. It's a magic process. Just to make things up. I'm used to nonfiction.
Okay, well, great. Thank you so much, Ruth, and thank you everybody who made it tonight, despite the rain and the wind and
Thank you for
wanting
coming.
to curl up. And maybe we'll get to do an author talk when you've published your historical fiction novel.
Okay.
Or for the event of a future play that you're putting on over Zoom, maybe.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.